Well, hello everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to this Saturday seminar with Booker Prize, Whitbread Prize and Commonwealth Writers' Prize nominated shortlisted author and Professor of English Literature at the University of Kent, Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah. And also Claire Chambers, lecturer in global literatures at the University of York. My name's Jenni Ramone. I work at Nottingham Trent University as a senior lecturer in postcolonial studies, and I'm also co-director of the Colonial and Postcolonial Studies Centre there with my colleague Anna Ball. Anna has had a very long relationship with the Nottingham Contemporary, and we're delighted to be able to present this event to you here today, which comes at the end of a long season of our Postcolonial Speakers Series events, which has included various events that are all open to the public, including a workshop on new South Asian literatures, which was run by our colleague Nicole Thiara, a film screening and question and answer session with up-and-coming new filmmaker Destiny Akaraga, who's just been nominated as Best Newcomer at the BFI Film Awards in London, and a storytelling event with Armenian storyteller Virgin Gulbenkian. I'm going to begin just by telling you a little bit about the format of today, and then I'll introduce Professor Gurnah and ask him to read from some of his work. So it will be a brief introduction. Abdulrazak Gurnah will read for around 25 minutes, and then we'll have a very short break, just in case you need a quick break to think about what you've heard. And then I'll introduce and invite Claire Chambers to come and have a dialogue with Abdulrazak Gurnah. I'll then join the conversation and then open up the conversation for questions and comments with you. And I hope that you'll feel welcome and able to ask questions, make any comments. We hope this will be a friendly, welcoming event, and we'd love to hear your views and your ideas. So I'd like to introduce Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah to you. Abdulrazak Gurnah was born in the island of Zanzibar off the coast of East Africa, and he first came to Britain as a student and works at the University of Kent as a Professor of Literature, as well as his academic publications, including in 2007 editing the Cambridge Companion to Salman Rushdie. Abdulrazak Gurnah has written a number of prestigious novels and been nominated for a number of prestigious literary prizes. Many of Abdulrazak Gurnah's novels, including Memory of Departure, Pilgrim's Way, Dotty, Admiring Silence, and The Last Gift, explore in various different ways the experience of migration to the UK. Paradise from 1994, which was shortlisted for both the Booker Prize and the Whitbread Prize, considers as well a different kind of journey, a journey that has been described as reminiscent of Heart of Darkness. In Paradise, a young and beautiful protagonist, a naive protagonist, is separated from his family, and he journeys into the interior of rural East Africa on a trading expedition. By the Sea, from 2001, is the novel which most directly addresses the sea and its meaning and resonances in terms of migration and the post-colonial experience. The novel is narrated by Saleh Omar, a 65-year-old asylum seeker from Zanzibar living in a seaside town in the UK. The text is rich in literary references, not least repeated references to Bartleby, the hero of Herman Melville's short story Bartleby the Scrivener. Now, Melville's best-known work, Moby Dick, is obviously much more closely concerned with the sea, but I'm interested to find out what role Bartleby plays in Abdulrazak Gurnah's imagining of the sea and migration, so perhaps that's something that we can discuss later. So please welcome Abdulrazak Gurnah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. For a moment there, I thought it was going to be professor, but you decided to drop that, so that's good. I suppose until somebody, like on this occasion, says how or in what way does the sea feature in your work, it's not necessarily how you think of it or how I think of it. It's a bad habit that I have of saying you when I mean I. So it's not that you think of it, it's how I think of it. Anyway, so it's not that I thought or think about the sea in this way that says it needs to kind of get in there into the work, but it is very often very revealing when at some stage in your career, in your writing career, after 2 or 3 books, somebody says, "Why are you always writing about journeys?" You think, because it's not always that this is something, that you deliberately want to make a motif. It's just that it's present, presumably, in your consciousness and in your way of thinking and so on. But I think by the time I came to be writing by the sea, I had realized that the sea was figuring rather prominently in my way of thinking. And then you find as you look back, and that yes, in almost every of these novels, there is the sea. I come from a small island. I was born on a small island, Zanzibar. I don't know if anybody here has been or even comes from there. It's not as small as many other islands. I mean, like Barbados is 10 miles across, for God's sake. It's not as small as that, but it is small enough. Particularly if you're somebody who lives in the town or was born in the town, then it is, most people know each other quite well. And my idea in thinking of by the sea was that here's someone who has lived in a small island in this town and known his life in this way, and comes to and migrates and leaves, and what kind of transformation. It's not just the transformation of his life, but of course the transformation of his consciousness. What does that do to somebody? Especially when, as the events in By the Sea is that he actually does meet somebody he does know, or who knows him, and he knew his father, and then becomes aware of other stories being opened up. In my writing, I'm very interested in remembering, in how people remember and understand what they remember. It's not just simply what you remember, but how you remember and what you do with it when you do remember. Because memory is not always something that you can turn on and off. Sometimes you can't. Things just keep coming, and you can't stop them coming. And you also, therefore, have to have ways of understanding it and coping with it and so on. So in a sense, one of the outcomes of, not uniquely so, but one of the outcomes of dislocation is that you are burdened and saddled with these things that you can't do anything about, that you can't reorganize, that you can't correct, that you can't put right by checking against something else, by going to see the person you're thinking about and thinking, does it still feel like that? In the memory remains fresh, and it still feels like that, and you don't know how it's being sort of replayed somewhere else. So in some ways it's quite burdensome, I think, to have to deal with these things as if they're fresh and immutable, but you still have to deal with them. So I'm going to read, here we are, a couple of sections which do feature the sea. This is the kind of thing you have to do, right? I'm here to talk about the sea. So there's one moment very early on when Saleh Omar is one narrator, there are two narrators, but at some point he says, he actually draws our attention to his circumstances in this way, and he says, I live in a small town by the sea, as I have all my life, though for most of it, it was by a warm green ocean a long way from here. Now I live the half-life of a stranger, glimpsing interiors through the television screen and guessing at the tireless alarms which afflict people I see in my strolls. So, but I want to take you a little later on to just in case it's not a narrative you're familiar with, when he arrives in as an asylum seeker, in the early part of the novel, he has an encounter with an immigration officer who puts him through what you would expect, questions and skepticism and so on. Indeed, what he expected as well. And then comes across this small box of incense and becomes both drawn to this, seduced by it, but in any case he decides to take it from him, the immigration officer. And so this is Saleh Omar's reflection on that loss, if you like. The incense is called Oud al-Kamari. Oud is incense in Arabic or in Swahili as well. And this particular oud, this particular incense is called Oud al-Kamari. So this is Saleh Omar reflecting on that, Oud al-Kamari. Oud al-Kamari, its fragrance comes back to me at odd times unexpectedly, like a fragment of a voice or the memory of my beloved's arm on my neck. Every Eid, I used to prepare an incense burner and walk around my house with it, waving clouds of perfume into its deepest corners, pacing the labors it had taken me to possess such beautiful things, rejoicing in the pleasure they brought to me and to my loved ones. Incense burner in one hand and a brass dish filled with oud in the other. Aloe wood, Oud al-Kamari, the wood of the moon. That was what I thought the words meant. But the man I obtained my consignment from explained that the translation was really a corruption of Khimari, Khmer, Cambodia, because that was one of the few places in the whole world where the right kind of aloe wood was to be found. The oud was a resin which only an aloe tree infected by fungus produced. A healthy aloe tree was useless, but the infected one produced this beautiful fragrance. Another little irony by you-know-who. The man I obtained the Oud al-Kamari from was a Persian trader from Bahrain who had come to our part of the world with the musim, the winds of the monsoons. He and thousands of other traders from Arabia, the Gulf, India and Sindh, and the Horn of Africa. They have been doing this every year for at least 1,000 years. In the last months of the year, the winds blow steadily across the Indian Ocean towards the coast of Africa, where the currents obligingly provide a channel to harbor. Then, in the early months of the new year, the winds turn around and blow in the opposite direction, ready to speed the traders home. It was all as if intended to be exactly thus, that the winds and currents would only reach the stretch of coast from southern Somalia to Sofala, at the northern end of what has become known as the Mozambique Channel. South of this stretch, the currents turned evil and cold, and ships that strayed beyond there were never heard of again. South of Sofala was an impenetrable sea of strange mists and whirlpools a mile wide, and giant luminescent stingrays rising to the surface in the dead of night, and monstrous squids obscuring the horizon. For centuries, intrepid traders and sailors, most of them barbarous and poor, no doubt, made the annual journey to that stretch of coast on the eastern side of the continent, which had cusped so long ago to receive the musim winds. They brought with them their goods and their God and their way of looking at the world, their stories and their songs and prayers, and just a glimpse of the learning which was a jewel of their endeavors. And they brought their hungers and greeds, their fantasies and lies and hatreds, leaving some among their numbers behind for whole lifetimes, and taking what they could buy, trade, or snatch away with them, including people they bought or kidnapped and sold into labor and degradation in their own lands. After all that time, the people who lived on that coast hardly knew who they were, but knew enough to cling to what made them different from those they despised among themselves, as well as among the outlying progeny of the human race in the interior of the continent. Then the Portuguese, rounding the continent, burst so unexpectedly and so disastrously from that unknown and impenetrable sea, and put paid to medieval geography with their seaborne cannons. They wreaked their religion-crazed havoc on islands, harbors, and cities, exulting over their cruelty to the inhabitants they plundered. Then the Omanis came to remove them and take charge in the name of the true God, and brought with them Indian money, with the British close behind, and close behind them the Germans and the French, and whoever else had the wherewithal. New maps were made, complete maps, so that every inch was accounted for, and everyone now knew who they were, or at least who they belonged to. Those maps, how they transformed everything. And so it came to pass that in time, those scattered little towns by the sea along the African coast found themselves part of huge territories stretching for hundreds of miles into the interior, teeming with people they had thought beneath them, and who, when the time came, promptly returned the favor. Among the many deprivations inflicted on those towns by the sea was the prohibition of the musim trade. The last months of the year would no longer see crowds of sailing ships lying plank to plank in the harbour, the sea between them glistening with slicks of their waste, or the streets thronged with Somalis or Suri Arabs or Sindhis buying and selling and breaking into incomprehensible fights, and at night camping in the open spaces, singing cheerful songs and brewing tea, or stretched out on the ground in their grimy rags, shouting raucous ribaldries at each other. In the first year or two after that, the streets and the open spaces were silent with their absences in those late months of the year, especially when you felt the lack of the things they used to bring with them: ghee and gum, cloths and crudely hammered trinkets, livestock and salted fish, dates, tobacco, perfume, rosewater, incense, and handfuls of all manner of wondrous things. We missed the ill-kempt gaiety they filled the town with, but soon we mostly forgot them, as they became unimaginable to the new lives we led in those early years after independence. In any case, perhaps they would not have gone on coming for much longer. Who would choose to come hundreds of miles across the sea to sell us cloth and tobacco when they could live a life of luxury in the rich states in the Gulf? And on the subject of maps, I thought I'd read you another little section. Still Saleh Omar. I speak to maps, and sometimes they say something back to me. This is not as strange as it sounds, nor is it an unheard of thing. Before maps, the world was limitless. It was maps that gave it shape and made it seem like territory, like something that could be possessed, not just laid waste and plundered. Maps made places on the edges of the imagination seem graspable and placeable. And later, when it became necessary, geography became biology in order to construct a hierarchy in which to place the people who lived in their inaccessibility and primitiveness in other places on the map. The first map I saw, though I must have seen others in innocence before that, was one a teacher showed us when we were 7 years old. I'm jumping a bit because we want to have plenty of time to chat. Anyway, he was 7 years old, he claims. I know I was 7 because it was my second year at school, and I have the integrity of the British Empire to bear me out, since I would have been 6 the year I started, as the rules required. The teacher introduced his subject in a dramatic fashion. He held up a hen's egg between thumb and forefinger. Who can tell me how to make this egg stand up on its end? That was how he introduced Christopher Columbus to us. It was a fabulous and unrepeatable moment, as if I too had stumbled across an unimagined and unexpected continent. It was the moment at the start of a story. As his story developed, he began to draw a map on the blackboard with a piece of white chalk. The coast of northwest Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, southern Europe, the land of Sham, Syria and Palestine, the coast of North Africa, which then bulged out and tucked in and then slid down to the Cape of Good Hope. As he drew, he spoke, naming places, sometimes in full, sometimes in passing. Sinuously north to the jut of the Ruvuma Delta, the cusp of our stretch of coast, the Horn of Africa. Then the Red Sea coast to Suez, the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, India, the Malay Peninsula, and then all the way to China. He stopped there and smiled, having drawn half the known world in one continuous line with his piece of chalk. He put a dot halfway down the east coast of Africa and said, "This is where we are, a long way from China." Then he put a dot in the North Mediterranean and said, "This is where Christopher Columbus was, and he wanted to go to China, but by following a route in the opposite direction." I don't remember much of what he told us about the adventures of greedy Cristobal. So many other stories have silted up over that innocent moment. But I remember that he said that Columbus set out on his voyage the same year as the fall of Granada and the expulsion of Muslims from Andalus. Those names too were new to me, as were so many of the others, but he said them with such reverence and longing, the fall of Granada and the expulsion of Muslims from Andalus, that I've never lost the moment. I see him now. I forgot about this. Thank you, Emma. I see him now, a short, plump man dressed in a kanzu, kofia, and faded brown jacket, his face pitted with smallpox scars, yet composed into a look of forbearance and tolerance. And I remember the fluency with which he created an image of the world for us, my first map. The egg? This was the story. The sailors on Columbus's ship had never sailed west into the Atlantic. Nobody had. For all anyone knew, the ocean suddenly ended, and its waters fell into gigantic chasm and then traveled through caverns and gorges under the earth to a depthless pool infested with monsters and devils. Then also the journey was long and difficult, the ocean empty. No glimpse of Cathay, however sharp-eyed the lookout. So the rabble grumbled and plotted. We want to go home. In the end, Columbus confronted them, holding a hen's egg between thumb and forefinger. "Which of you can make this egg stand on its end?" he asked. None of them could, of course. They were only sailors, doomed to play superstitious bit parts in such high drama and grumble and cook up improbable plots. Columbus gently cracked the end of the egg. The teacher demonstrated with his own egg, and then stood it on the quarterdeck rail. I'm not sure now whether the moral was that in order to eat an egg you have to crack it, and therefore in order to find Cathay you have to put up with suffering, or whether it was just to demonstrate that Columbus was a great deal cleverer than the sailors, and was therefore more likely to be right about the most sensible course of action. In any case, the sailors immediately gave up any thought of insurrection and sailed on in search of the Grand Khan, as I would have done when I was 7. The teacher carefully put his hard-boiled egg down on his desk for later consumption. We never had that teacher again. although he was a regular teacher at the school. Our class teacher was absent that day, and he was looking after us for the morning. At the end of the morning, we trooped out to go back to our class, and when I peeped in later to see the world he had shown us, the map had been wiped off the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now have a very short 5-minute break in case you'd like to just gather your thoughts, and then I'll introduce Claire Chambers and we'll begin the discussion and dialogue part of today's seminar. So we'll meet back in 5 minutes. In post-colonial literatures, and she has a special interest and relationship with Pakistan, although she is particularly interested in the Muslim world in general. Among the many exciting and varied things that Claire has done in her career, she's taught in Pakistan for a year, and she's twice been invited to be a literary panel member at the Karachi Literature Festival. She's the author of British Muslim Fictions, Interviews with Contemporary Writers, which was published in 2011. And it's in that book that Claire interviewed Abdulrazak Gurnah for the first time, which is why I thought it might be a really nice idea to bring them back together here to continue their discussion. Claire is also author of Multicultural Textualities, which is a monograph tracing the history and development of artistic depictions of Muslims in Britain throughout history until the present day. She's also a founding scholar in a new research group that analyses literary texts as part of an investigation into multiculturalism. So Claire is very well placed to join us today, and I'm really looking forward to listening to their discussion and then inviting you all to contribute as well and join in. So please welcome Claire. And thank you to Jenni for inviting me, and it is great to be back. In fact, I've only interviewed you once, Abdulrazak, so it's a real privilege to be doing it again. But I am rather nervous having said, that you get asked these questions like, why do you always write about journeys? And I find myself crossing questions out. But my first question is a little bit similar to why do you always write about journeys? Because I just wanted to start by asking you, you've recognised yourself that you do have this interest in the sea that you made apparent, particularly in By the Sea, one of your more recent novels. But I wondered what it was about seas and oceans, and particularly the Indian Ocean, that draws your attention again and again.
Yeah, I didn't mean that there's something sort of like troublesome about being asked about journeys or about whatever. I was really meaning that it's that you don't always consciously do things, and then somebody asks you, why are there so many uncles? And I think, why? But it's obviously something that you're being kind of like truthful to an experience, which you're not always being conscious about. Obviously a lot of what you do, I don't want to make it seem as if writing is something that you do in a kind of a daze. Obviously a lot of it is thought out and so on, but what I think maybe some of the power from writing actually comes from those things that are happening anyway, in addition to what the writer is consciously trying to do, from what the writer has experienced, or indeed what is suggested perhaps by certain memories or certain events or certain ways of putting things. So it's fine to think about why journeys, why uncles, or why the sea, all of these things, because in fact what those kinds of things do is they made me as a person who is doing the writing think rather more in a more directed way about some of those issues which have evidenced themselves in what I do. And they're all perfectly reasonable things. Journeys, because of the kinds of experiences not only that I have had, but I think are kind of archetypal now, paradigmatic at least, experiences of our contemporary world for millions. In a way, they always have been, of course. It's just that the predominant direction in the last 2 centuries or so has been out of Europe. and the last maybe 100 years or so, it's in this direction. But it doesn't mean, because if we were to go back to another period, there will be movements of other kinds and so on. But so far as thinking about our contemporary world, journeys are really kind of like a paradigm of people's understanding life and so on. And what's so interesting and important about this is that we understand the world, it seems to me, through the kind of stories we're able to tell about it. Of course, in addition to that, we have encyclopedias and history books and so on. But in another sense, in a kind of sense of how we intuit the world and how we grasp it, comprehend it, it seems to me very often we do this through the kind of narratives that we make. Not necessarily that we possess already, but that we're also renewing and refashioning and so on. Which, of course, is why you have things like Syria grasping the imagination of the West, because just simply cannot get it out of their minds that they can no longer go around the world doing whatever they want. But, that sort of awareness hasn't quite come in. It seems perfectly reasonable to say, hey, we can't have that. Let's go and bomb them, or whatever it might be. Back to the sea. So, the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean, and my interest in, and many other people's interest in the Indian Ocean, is because it's a way of thinking about that story, that I'm a way of understanding the world, etc. So, the version of what those places are, say Africa, for example, India, that these are separate places with their particular histories, but also in the modern sense, that history has its provenance, if you like, from European accounts of it, as if other accounts did not exist, or if they did, they were not quite as accurate as ours, or they were, to some extent, there were sort of medieval ways of understanding the world, etc. And this is perfectly reasonable in a way that, as we all know, it's always those who are in control at the time who tell the most powerful stories, because they tell stories that have a kind of completeness, they have an end to them, whereas the other stories have to stop with the appearance of this more powerful force that then transforms them. Colonialism, say. So Africa is a separate place from India, from Arabia, from Persia, from China. These are discrete places that kind of studied through their languages or through the whatever it might be. But it didn't feel like that if you were, say, growing up in a place like Zanzibar or places along the coast, or probably India. It didn't feel like these were separate places. And what was missing, of course, was the very important and ancient, in the sense of at least hundreds of years, culture that pre-existed this colonial account of the history of these places. And I guess that's why the sea or the ocean is such a significant thing for, not just for me, but I think for many people who are wanting now to understand things differently. So in one respect, I think can have written both here and also in other kinds of writing, in papers and so on, that in one way of thinking, the east coast of Africa is actually the Western Indian Ocean, rather than the east coast of Africa. See what I mean? So you could think of it as part of a cultural system, in which, if we think of it as an Indian Ocean system, it actually also makes sense. It makes sense because if you read other texts, you find that that's how, texts before European texts, certainly if you read travelers' texts, like famous ones like Ibn Battuta, but even less famous ones, sailor narratives, sailor manuals that give instructions on how to get around in the Indian Ocean, they would think of it as a place which is kind of like in a system, rather than, and of course there's the example that I read of the Muslim, of people coming and going back and forth regularly, which they still do, they just fly now, but there is still this sense of people coming in. So it's real, it's not in fact a forced conception, but it's a better way of understanding the cultural life, if you like, of both the east coast of Africa, of Somalia and southern Arabia, and all of those places, and why those connections are important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've used the word archipelago to describe these townships. And in the reading that you did, I think you said scattered little towns by the coast, in by the sea. Archipelago is something that writers like Amitav Ghosh and also academics like Janet Abdulrazak have also used the same word to describe the towns on the coast of the Indian Ocean, Africa and India, and how they might have more in common than the hinterlands in their own countries. So I sort of wonder what these sort of connections are. Are they linguistic, religious, cultural, myths, or what sort of connections do you see along this archipelago?
Well, the most obvious connections are historical, of course. So they have a shared history of trade. So trade is absolutely crucial to this whole business, the back and forth, but of course religion as well. So the earliest archaeological evidence that has been found of mosques, I suppose, of Islamic buildings on the coast is on the island of Manda. You've been to Zanzibar. Have you been to Lamu as well? No. Well, has anybody been to Lamu here? Okay, Manda is a small island just off Lamu, which is on the very north coast. It is in some ways the very northern edge of what you might think of as a Swahili culture. In other words, where people still speak Swahili. It's quite likely that Mogadishu would have been the furthest north of Swahili culture, probably around about that time, like Ibn Battuta visited there in the 13th century, but that they were pushed back with various changes of movements of populations, as happens inevitably. But certainly Lamu, until today, Lamu in some ways you would think of as the heartland of Swahili culture, where they claim they speak the best Swahili and the most poetic and blah, 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 that kind of thing. A bit like Cornwall. Anyway, Manda is a small island off the island of Lamu, and the earliest evidence they've found of any kind of Islamic structure has been found on that island by a group of archaeologists who've been working on the East Coast for various decades now, led by Professor Mark Horton. And they've been able to date that around about, they think, the 9th century or so. Now, the significance of this, of course, is that Islam does not even come into being till the late 6th century, and does not, of course, begin to spread in any important sense until 7th, 8th century. So you're talking very, very early Islamic influence in that part of the coast of East Africa. And so you can imagine that if centuries of increasing Islamic influence, what that did and would have done in relation to your question is it would have drawn that those East Coast little towns into the Islamic world, if you like, and would have shared both the Quran and all the stories, if you like, associated with that, and would have shared other stories and other heroisms to do with Islamic expansion and so on. So they would have seen themselves not just as little towns on the coast, but part of the Islamic world, and would have known about that, both in relation to the words of the religion, but also all those narratives of heroic adventures as far as Russia and whatever and whatever and whatever. So there wouldn't have been an isolated little group of towns at all, really. But they would have been part of a cosmopolitan construction, not a European cosmopolitan, but another kind of cosmopolitanism, in which they would have seen themselves as worldly people who knew about India, who knew about China, who knew about all of these things. But then in addition to this, you actually have the actual presence. Again, things that not so well known, but the Chinese emperors of the 14th century or so, certainly before the Portuguese, were very interested in finding out about Africa and trading with Africa, mainly for trade. And at least 2 quite considerable armadas, if we call them that. Armada always has a kind of military dimension to it, although these were trade armadas of hundreds of boats. They used to think like that. You don't just go out there and trade with a couple of ships like the Portuguese did when they sent Vasco da Gama. You send an army of ships. And they did, and this is recorded, and they came as far as possibly Mombasa, Malindi, that North Kenya coast. Certainly there's plenty of evidence of the pottery that they left behind, but also Chinese stories of narratives on their return, including various animal specimens and so on. But they decided that there wasn't much trade to be had, so they didn't bother staying. They went back home. So there are indeed really quite astonishing connections in this way historically. And these are the significances are that these stories not only did not cease, but these stories are still potent today. So in a way of thinking about this is that colonialism did not actually put a stop to this particular narrative.
And I think that's really helpful for us to think about this thing that you flagged up in the reading, this idea of a small island, and that the small island could be Zanzibar, it could be Britain. And it was, in the recent discussions of Syria, which you mentioned, was it a Russian diplomat insulted Cameron by calling Britain a small island?
I believe so.
And then you've got Andrew Levy's novel of the same name that's playing with the idea of Caribbean islands and also Britain with its sort of Eurocentric, closed-inwards attitude. So I guess, and you still live on the coast, I was thinking, in Canterbury, in Kent. So you have, when you talked about the writer's experience, also shaping your interest in the ocean. I guess you've mostly lived quite near the sea, on different sized islands. So there's kind of a few questions there, but I guess there's something I'm guessing at it about, is there such a thing as an island mentality?
Yes, I'm sure there is. I know that people make this claim in particular about, say, for example, the South Pacific Islands. But on the other hand, I don't think living in the kind of Zanzibar I lived in, which is mostly urban, and filled with these stories, I should have said also Alf Lela Lela, of course, 1001 Nights was another of those links. It didn't feel small island at all. It felt that you're part of this big place. It didn't feel. I remember hearing my father talking with his friends, which happened plenty. There wasn't much to do in Zanzibar in the evenings, so plenty of talk going on. And as a small child, I remember hearing them talking about the world, not as if they were talking in a kind of sort of particular bombastic way or something, but just talking about Indonesia and about this place and about that place because they've been there or because of a political development that's going on, and also nearer places, the Comoros, Madagascar, and so. And these were well-traveled people. These were people who didn't think of themselves as small island people, who thought of themselves as people in the world, and who didn't, I'm pretty sure, feel intimidated by another kind of knowledge, which is the school knowledge, as it were, that we would bring home after school. I would listen with interest, but it wasn't quite as important as knowing about Indonesia. So, as you proudly come home and you learn about, I certainly remember this one example, proudly coming home, and I've just found out how it is that the bladder works, digestion and all that. Astonishing information. I didn't realize that. I thought these things just kind of happened. And you sit in a biology class and you realize it's this and this is taken out there. But it was particularly how urine is formed and goes into the bladder, and of course it's expelled. I thought, this is fantastic. And I went home and tried to tell my parents about this, and they listened politely to all this. And said, oh, that's very interesting, yes. And then they want to talk about these other, much more important things. So, what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is that it wasn't that one knowledge was more important than another, but one knowledge also had integrity of its own kind. They didn't see themselves as people captured in some kind of medieval narrative of some kind, whereas there is this more powerful kind of knowledge. In reality, of course, this other knowledge is more powerful, because it then comes to dominate, as we understand, the modern world. But I'm saying there wasn't in them, I don't think, a sense of being ignorant people.
And I suppose when we think about globalization, it often the debate seems to be about something that's just been discovered with the rise of the internet. It's very recent. idea of collapsing of national boundaries and people talking to each other online. But maybe in fictions of the Indian Ocean, your own writing, Amitav Ghosh's and people like that, M.G. Vasanji, there's a sense that these connections have a much, much longer history.
Yeah, undoubtedly they do. As I'm trying to explain. But I mean, globalization is a troublesome term anyway, because what underlies it is really an implicit advance of Western values and Western commerce, if not Western value. Whereas I prefer the word cosmopolitan, not just cosmopolitan is also a word which has been dirtied in some way because of the way the term has been used. But there is a way of using the word cosmopolitan without the nasty part of it. Especially if you understand cosmopolitanisms rather than one notion of what cosmopolitan means. So that, in other words, you can have a Pakistan, Afghan, that area can have its own sense of its cosmopolitanism, which may have nothing to do with Europe, but may indeed be a kind of mix of cultures and positions. So the Indian Ocean, it seems to me, is a cosmopolitanism like that. So when you say globalization, I also want to say globalizations, rather than some sense of only one way in which culture or commerce, as I say, advances into places in the world that haven't been reached by this yet. But yeah, I think it's very important that people understand that about themselves, and know that about themselves, and know about other places. So you meet a Somali in Kano, in Nigeria. I remember when I was teaching there, and I said, Zanzibari food is brilliant. I said, have you been there? No. We all know Zanzibari food is brilliant. Now, Somali's got a long way, really, from Zanzibar. But this sort of knowledge about places and about each other is also part of the kind of current of what people know about other places.
And talking about knowledge, I was struck by the fact you just told an anecdote about being taught about digestion at school. In your reading, there was the teacher with the egg and showing the map. And then in the story I've just been reading on the train, rereading, there's a special issue of Wasafiri on the Indian Ocean, and your story in that, again, has a teacher showing a little boy a map, which is the Framaro 15th century map of the world, which is inverted with south at the top. So kind of interested that this image comes up a lot.
Yeah, I was tempted to read that, but
yeah.
I thought, by the sea is easier because this is a sea event. But it's a very interesting map, which I think is included in that issue, isn't it?
I think so.
But which the upside down, by the way, is not particularly significant. I looked into that. See, why has he got the map upside down? Because apparently that was how maps were done. It's difficult at first to understand why. Why would you do a map that shows the world upside down? But if you think about it, say if you take the Nile, for example, and you're an Egyptian map maker, you would start. It would make sense to have the river flowing south to north. It just doesn't make sense because you're looking at a page. See, how can a river flow upwards? It must flow downwards. So you turn the map over, and then the Nile starts at the top and goes down to the bottom, as you would expect a river to do. That makes sense. Straightforward, isn't it? So there are various ways in which it made complete sense to have, say, the Mediterranean as the center of the world, because these map-making cultures were mostly at that point Mediterranean cultures. That's the center. And then you have the other places either above or below, depending on how you wanted to do it. In some cases, medieval European maps put Jerusalem as the center of the world. And so then, equally, other places were made to sort of figure around it. Framaro's brief, as it were, was to make a map of the Indian Ocean, because the King of Portugal, who had commissioned him to do this, wanted to investigate. Really, he wanted to be reassured, but he gave Framaro a kind of open brief. could you find out from what is known about the Indian Ocean, is it an open sea or is it a closed sea? As you know, the Ptolemaic map shows that the Indian Ocean is closed, that there is a southern continent that closes it, so that it is in fact, what's the word they use about circumambient waters or something like that, that it wasn't part of that system of waters that were open to each other, but it was closed. And this would, you can imagine, would have been worrying the Portuguese authorities and sailors. Are they going to go all the way down there, and then in fact there is no way back up because there is land all across there? So this was the brief, was to investigate this in the hope that in fact there is a way around, which they didn't know for sure at that time. Framaro didn't go anywhere near the Indian Ocean. He did all this living on the island of Murano, which is in the Venice Lagoon, which had a monastery, which still has a monastery. And he just sat there and, and he drew this fantastic map of the Indian Ocean. And he did it entirely from stories and narratives and other people's maps. Now, who would have been these people? Most of them were people, sailors from the Indian Ocean, who traveled, even then, who were traveling to the Mediterranean and beyond, as far as Venice, to trade and to pass on these stories to each other. Sailors were doing this all the time as a way of knowing the world. So many of if you look at the map there, if you look at the map in detail as well, you'll see that across the ocean there are these little flags which you can't actually read. That is to say, you can't read on the illustration, but you can read if you have the image itself, and you can enlarge, and they all have writing, and you would have been able to read that also in the original map. And they all have writing, and all of them contain little bits of information and what their sources are. And most of these sources would have been people who had written various manuals and various commentaries and so on about the Indian Ocean. This is really what I was saying about what was known before and was kind of superseded by later information. So there is a whole scholarship and writing about the Indian Ocean. There's also a very interesting book which came out this year by a man called Anthony Casale, if anybody's interested in the Indian Ocean, which I think is called Ottoman Exploration or something like that. But anyway, Casale, which also refers extensively to archive material which is held in the Topkapi Library in Istanbul, which certainly predates the appearance of the Portuguese. Anyway, so this also prompted that story, that idea of Framaro and somebody trying to understand and to explain to a boy whom he's coaching, teaching, tutoring, who would have grown up in a colonial education, as it were, this sort of information about the sea. But anyway, it's an interesting map. Do take a look at that Wasafiri if you get a chance.
And then I guess finally, this discussion of maps, in your reading, you wrote, in By the Sea, you wrote, maps made the land seem like territory to be owned, something like that. And walking around the exhibition, it struck me, one of the things that the exhibition, one of the points that it seems to be making is how little we know about the sea as compared with the land, and how a lot of it is, from the imagination. And what you can't do with maps of the ocean is a kind of uncharted space, and you can't draw boundaries. The sea resists that. So I wondered, just broad points really about cartography and colonialism.
Well, I mean, there's many kind of different issues there. Of course, cartography is important as a way of understanding the world. But as you know, I'm sure, cartography, particularly, say, for example, in India, was used very deliberately as a way of expropriating or appropriating or acquiring land. Once you make a map, there's your sphere of influence. You don't have to do anything. You've just drawn it. You've surveyed it. It belongs to you. Or if you think of the 85 Berlin Congress, all they had was this map, and they just drew lines on it. And so maps also have this quality of being territory, and once you can draw lines on it, it becomes like a deed. You own it. You can simply lay claim. So probably many parts of the world which nominally belong to this and that and that and that European, because most of the world belong to European states at a certain point, where no European or any European agent had ever set foot in, or perhaps even at the time of independence. There may have been parts of these various places, one imagines anyway, it's possible, that had never actually seen an agent of this empire that apparently owned it, and would have been great news to the people who lived in that area that they belonged to whoever, Italy or Britain or something like that. But nonetheless, the maps gave, and still do, gave a kind of legality to this whole exercise, and still do. And indeed, of course, continues in the post-colonial dimension of it, as continuing a kind of legalism that says this belongs to this and that belongs to that. So maps are powerful, not only as ways of imagining, which they are, or of understanding, but also claiming and acquiring and dispossessing. And in a way, there are also ways, it seems to me, when I say dispossessing, I mean, in an obvious way, there are ways of dispossessing, because there are ways of saying, we now rule you. But there are also ways of dispossessing culturally, actually kind of wiping out something that may have existed before, or connections that may have existed before. So culturally, actually, in a way, stealing cultures from people, so that you are no longer part of that, you are now part of this. It's sort of altering things in quite a profound way, without the consent or even understanding or awareness of the people who are being altered in this way.
Thanks very much.
You mentioned briefly the exhibition, and I just wanted to ask a question about the exhibition to both of you. I was wondering whether there are any pieces in the exhibition that you were particularly interested in, that you thought had any resonances with your work, or for either of you with other post-colonial literary texts.
I think I've talked quite a bit. Why don't you go, Claire?
Okay. Well, I think I didn't have much time to spend too long there, but I found the Kubla Khan, the Coleridge engravings, the series of those, really interesting, because it just made me think that it's not just post-colonial writing. I mean, I've been, in my preparation, I've mostly been thinking about your work and Amitav Ghosh, M.G. Vasanji, and some of these writers who are well known. And also Caribbean writers like Derek Walcott were coming up a lot. And to be reminded in your introduction as well of, that more mainstream writers have been doing this for a very long time as well. Coleridge and Melville, who you mentioned. So I think that was what struck me the most.
I was very interested in that video. The video of the Black Atlantis, something like that, is it called? Sorry? That's a picture from it, yeah. As a way of thinking about that event, which maybe it's a little, you keep bumping into that ship, Zong, so often, that it almost, you think, oh no, not again. But I think it does something really quite interesting with it, this idea that that those thrown overboard sort of mutate into organisms with gills and whatever. Well, of course, we don't see them. I wish we did. To see what kind of image he might have come up with as a result of that. But it's an interesting idea, so, as a way of talking about survivals, and kind of imagining that, in fact, those people thrown overboard didn't die, which indeed is an idea that Walcott and many other Caribbean writers have also sustained. Indeed, Shakespeare does, I suppose. with aerial song, 4, 5 and 5s and so on. So this is an interesting way of using that same thing, I thought. The music was a bit, because I've got a bit of a problem with my ear at the moment. So I don't know if the music sounded kind of dull, kind of thuddy, because I wasn't hearing very well, or if that is the case. But I thought the images were good. And the transcription, the writing was quite, what would be a good word to use here? Kind of like inviting without always revealing itself. I enjoyed that.
Okay. There was one piece that I particularly was drawn to, and I'm not really sure why, so perhaps you can share ideas, or perhaps other people here can share ideas as well. I really liked Anna Mendietta's series of 9 photographs, which is a kind of hollow, a kind of hole of the shape of a body, and the sea gradually, or in different ways, washes away this imprint of a body from the sand. And sometimes there's a red liquid that looks a little bit like blood, or even perhaps paint on that body, which is also being washed away and washed into the rest of the sea.
So what do you think the red is?
Well, I think it's probably the blood of, potentially, I don't know, the one thing, it could be the red of the blood of somebody who has died in some kind of conquest, or perhaps in attempting to conquer that land, or perhaps the native who was conquered in that space and whose body is buried there. It could even be the red of supposed civilization, painting, that kind of thing, coming to that place. I'm not sure.
There's a lurid there. But I saw one of the photographs. I don't know if you've seen this, but one of the photographs had a hole in the ground right next to that, as if, in other words, an animal lived in there. Yeah. And all around it were red marks. So I thought an animal was living in there. Some birds live in the ground like that, or indeed another kind of animal, and it got by a predator. And that this is what the red marks all around are, which then are also washed into the sea. Yeah. But anyway, yours sound much more interesting.
I was thinking about the exhibition as well, and lots of the works in the exhibition seem to involve the sea in whatever kind of human endeavour is being undertaken, as if the sea is somehow complicit in whatever's going on. Whereas, just kind of briefly thinking myself about literary texts, it seems that literature doesn't do that. Literature retains the sense of the sea as being a benign, passive vehicle for whatever's going on. So in lots of writing about slave ships, Carol Phillips writing, for instance, the sea is never complicit in what's going on. The sea is always a kind of a blank space in the way that it's been described in some of the writing about this exhibition, something invisible, something that doesn't really play a part in human activity. I'm not sure whether you'd agree with that.
But
or
not in the Indian context, because there's this idea of the Kalapani, the black water, that if you cross the sea you'll lose caste. So I think for a lot of early Indian texts, or Indian subcontinental, we'd now think of it, the sea is quite a malevolent force, and quite a that fearing to cross the sea, unless you're on a pilgrimage where you might be exempted from that. So when I was thinking about this, I think it's probably a bit context specific.
Yeah, I mean, most of what I've been talking about is, I suppose, not really the sea as people who live by the sea. So it's really about people who live on land, but near the sea. So the sea is somehow part of what makes it possible for these connections to take place. There's a wonderful image in a novel called Cities of Salt by a Syrian writer, Abdurrahman Munif, I think. Is that right?
He's Saudi.
He's Saudi?
Yes.
But is he not born Syrian?
Oh, maybe.
Yeah. In which he describes how these people who live by the sea in the Arabian Peninsula, how is an image of how they withdraw as the sea comes in. When you're walking on the beach, that almost in fear. So as the sea comes in, they kind of keep retreating from it, and that the sea is frightening. I think it's both these things. The sea is not only frightening for those who have to work it, but it's also frightening for people who live beside it. partly because they don't work on it. And you're saying how the sea is calm in Carol Phillips and many other texts because we don't really know the sea. And those who do know the sea, like Conrad or Melville, do speak of its ferocity, speak of it with awe and fear. But certainly I don't know the sea, but I have lived by the sea. So what I write about is that experience, I think, of living by the sea and having the sea there as something you see every day, etc.
And in By the Sea you write that people had suspicions about people who worked at sea, and they thought that the sea's unruly emptiness might do all kinds of things.
There is that. Sailors always have this reputation of having such a hard life that it makes them all kind of strange.
You mentioned Melville, so I have to ask at this point, why Bartleby? What part does Bartleby play in By the Sea? And is there to an extent, are you also making a reference that isn't spoken to Moby Dick as well, or was that not in your mind at all?
Not probably Moby Dick, although I do at various points in my writing. Moby Dick I did my undergraduate dissertation on Moby Dick, so it kind of has stayed with me all my life. Bartleby, I was interested because of silence. That idea of Saleh Omar deciding not to defend himself, not to speak, not to tell his narrative to people like the immigration officer who would not value it, who would treat it as a lie or who would misunderstand it. So he chooses silence. And of course that immediately... But also because he had come across this story himself when these books were appearing in his life. But it was mostly that notion of what does it mean? What does it mean for Bartleby that he is silent? What does it mean to be silent when confronted with something as dangerous as your freedom, losing your freedom? That was the reason.
Okay, thank you.
But then, once you start thinking about these things, there are qualities in Bartleby which remain puzzling to readers, even who have analysed and disagree. So it's an interesting story to have as a kind of counter story to this kind of silence.
Yeah, especially as in your text, the two narrators constantly ask each other to question their own memories, and histories are constantly being questioned as to their validity, as to what might have happened, what could have been seen, what might have been imagined.
Yeah, sure. Although, of course, the great thing about the story Bartleby is that Bartleby does not say anything apart from, I don't want to say anything. And he doesn't actually, in the end, come up with, say, well, okay, since you really want to know, here it is.
Yeah.
He doesn't deliver. He doesn't give us that satisfaction of saying the real story is. So we still don't know why he is as he is. What has driven him to this point, if anything in particular.
Okay, thank you. Okay, at this point I'd like to invite questions from the audience, and I think we have a roving mic as well, which I think Chloe is going to use, so thank you very much, Chloe. So please do feel free to share your comments or questions, and let Chloe know when you have them to ask.
You used the phrase transformation of consciousness earlier on when you were talking, and I was thinking of, in terms of your creativity, what can that mean is really what I was thinking. And I've read a little bit of Soyinka and how his creativity is rooted in his Yoruba background, and the metaphors and the philosophical things that feed into his creative energy. And so I wondered, for yourself as a writer, what place Zanzibar played in your creative agency, and what transformations of consciousness occurred by going from that island to this one.
Right, so you want me to tell you my life story, basically? No, it's a good question. It's just I don't know if I can give you a short answer about that, because for a start, I suppose it would be true to say it isn't a static sort of change from one thing to another. There's sort of continuous accretion and additions and changes of direction and so on. And in the case of, well, if I may just go back to Schenker, in the case of Schenker, his embrace of Yoruba mythology and religion and culture, to a certain extent, is a corrective one. That he was brought up as a mission boy. His father was a priest, and he was brought up in a very, very Christian household, where there would have been a great deal of discouragement to looking at these things. So this is an adult embrace of those very things that he thinks are defining for his society, but which he has been disallowed, as it were. And so it also comes at the point of independence, when there is a sort of, again, an embrace of indigeneity, and particularly in the form of myth and metaphor and so on. We don't need their metaphors, we've got our own, that sort of thing. I think possibly, I mean, there are various things, as you might imagine, if you just think of our lives, there are various things that figure prominently as powerful moments, and clearly moving from that to this would have been one of those, as it would be for anybody, for most people who make that big a change in their lives. I think also in my case, it was quite important and significant and transforming in some ways that I left and was unable to return, even had wanted to. It's very hard, on the whole, in practice, for migrants to return anyway. Partly because there is a sense of waiting until you've achieved something before you return. So you don't want to return empty-handed. You want to wait till you can take something back. And this, for many people, doesn't actually happen in that way. And also, of course, as you stay on, your life becomes more complicated anyway. You get married, you have children, you buy a house, you get a job, and so on. But by the time all this has sorted itself out, you get old, might as well stay here. So it's actually quite hard to do that. But in my case, I also couldn't return, and knew I couldn't return for a long, long time. Or I thought forever, but in fact, in the end, that changed. That also changes that sense of what there means and what here means. Not some place you can go visit and kind of revive. Although it's still more complicated than that. Maybe for those reasons, both the rupture, as it were, and the memory of what was left behind had a stronger significance than we might have done. But I probably see that those were the events that were kind of central to my way of thinking about that dislocation or rupture and what it means. And of course, as time passes, there's reading to do. And as you read, that too transforms what you know and how you understand things and how you compare other experiences, not just experiences of people, but of cultures, of times, and so on. So a number of things. I think reading is, I probably would have given that answer up front, that it's reading for a writer, it seems to me. That it's reading that is the most significant experience. But reading is not indiscriminate, even though it is at a certain age. You just consume everything. But after a while, it is no longer indiscriminate, and you do select and pursue certain kinds of lines of things. And obviously that choice implies that that there is a subject that you're interested in, or subjects that you're interested in. So it's not one sentence, but it's an attempt to address your question in some way.
So you've talked quite a lot about the sea as a kind of space, and a kind of a scene of various different crossings between Indian Ocean communities or colonial crossings. And I wondered if you might want to talk a bit more about the sea as a substance. And I was kind of thinking about the idea of a sea as a the sea as a transformative space and it changing people in the act of crossing. But I wondered if that might be to some extent the property of water in general, and how that works specifically in the crossing of the sea in contrast to things like crossings of rivers, because it seems like there is something in the substance of water as well as in the space of the sea that factors into that process of change, if I've made that question clear.
I think this is your PhD thesis.
Kind of. So maybe you can, solve my PhD questions for me.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Obviously, you've been thinking about it, and no doubt have been investigating and analysing the text that you're looking at with that kind of idea in mind. I'm not sure if it's water alone. That's the issue in the kind of changes and transformation. As I mentioned a moment ago, I would have thought also the life on the sea, for those who live on the sea or by the sea in the sense of it being part of their lives, like people who work in the sea or something like that. I would have thought it would be not just water that's the issue. I would have thought, for example, wind would be an issue. I would have thought, the abrasiveness of the medium they're dealing with, it's not just water, it's salt water, which transforms faces, changes, kind of burns skin and all the kinds of things like that. So I'm not sure. No doubt there is something truly significant about substance, about water as substance, and how you are in it, how you live in it, work in it, and so on. But I would say that there's something else, something about what makes the sea dangerous is not just this water that's deep, but also currents, wind, blah, blah, sun, etc., all of those things. How's that for trying to get out of your question?
No, that's a really good answer. The idea of the wind is particularly interesting because it is the wind that creates waves on the sea, so that kind of interaction between those two different things, it's not just about things coming out of the water, but that interactive process.
Good. That was a difficult one.
Thank you for your answer.
Well, no, I'll think about some more, though, because I hadn't, to be honest, really thought about the way, that the substance itself is significant in some way. So, something for me to take away. This is when questions are very difficult, this is what you say. I've got to think about that.
Are there any?
I very much enjoyed your reading when you were talking about the use by Columbus of the egg as a teaching tool, as a way of teaching or communicating his authority, and the way in which that lesson is repeated in the classroom alongside the drawing of a map. And it made me think, when I was listening to it, that the egg itself sounded a bit like a kind of a map. I wondered if you thought that there's a sort of relationship between the two that isn't just about, the drawing of maps and the cartographic imaginary combining with the symbol of authority, of colonial authority. Is there another kind of relationship there that you're pointing to?
Yeah, well, because it was so intriguing. I've heard different versions of this story, by the way. I used to think that this was our story, that was told to us when we were children. But in fact, when I've read that passage elsewhere, people said, no, he didn't crack the egg. He did this or that. So there are other versions of this. But what was intriguing is that, because this is a real event that happened to me as a child. The first time I heard the story of Columbus was precisely like this. The teacher did hold up an egg. And I assumed, in my memory, I think anyway, I'm sure this is so, I assumed the egg had something to do with it. That the egg is something to do with the shape of the world or something. Because of course I knew the world was round. At the age of 7, I already had that story. What I didn't know was that journey of Columbus. So as the story goes on and the egg is kind of there, I think it's going to be part of it somehow. But of course it isn't, apart from, which is why in the telling of it, it sort of occurs as an afterthought. So he's come to the end of his map and then said, oh yeah, and the egg. What about the egg? So then there's that explanation of the egg. So I can't see a connection. But at the time it felt as if there should be one, exactly as you felt.
I think there is, because barriers of travel and journey, whereas the conception of the world as a kind of geometric entity that is smooth and continuous, that's all our kind of source. It's a combination of the two, I find, that's what I like to think about. Perceiving the world as an end, it's that kind of smooth surface, and as a map as well, is what allows the blended vision to be successful. But of course, it was very important about that.
Well, as I say, I wouldn't have been able to put it quite so clearly as that. I thought there was an intriguing connection that the teacher didn't point out and wasn't forcing the issue, but by maybe just leaving it like that, then we would see egg, world, round, and so on, something like that. You know? But I was more interested in the idea that there are different versions of this. So you know, other people. Had anybody heard this story? There was a child, as it were. No. Okay. Maybe it was in Germany. Maybe they tell it in Germany. They don't tell it here.
Are there any further questions? Okay, well...
There's somebody there.
Sorry.
Just thinking about the passage you were reading about maps, I was just wondering about how stories counteract maps and writing in a way that they can be retold in different ways, whereas once you've written something, it's set. And I just see kind of the idea of the boy looking back in the classroom and looking at the map, and it was no longer there, so it's been wiped out. And I was almost thinking as an image of stories being rewritten, but also kind of new ways of looking at things, which kind of counteract in a bit, kind of cartography.
Okay, so maybe also to say what's the meaning of that event there. He goes back. The earlier question that we might put to that is, why does he go back? What is it that makes him want to look at that experience, that moment again? Or rather, is it to look at that experience or to look at the world? I would imagine that for most of those people in that class, that outline that the teacher made would not have been unfamiliar. What I mean by that is that most classrooms probably at some point would have a map of the world somewhere lying about. So it wouldn't be entirely unfamiliar. What might have been unfamiliar is that it's all connected. It can all be done in one continuous line. So the world is, of course, not America, because that isn't figuring in that version. But so one way of thinking about it is that what he's showing them is that the world is connected in this way. And also that it is known. It isn't, whereas America is not, but this world is known in some way. So what is it that he's going back to see? Maybe part of the answer is he's going back to see again those senses, not just to look at this map, or to recapture that moment of, as he says, of being at the beginning of a story, of kind of having experienced something which he hadn't before, the story of Columbus. For all of these reasons, and he goes there and it's gone. I don't know if I would say that it means that then another version has to be produced. Although that's an interesting thought, because indeed it would be, and it wouldn't look quite the same. Or whether it's also another way of thinking of it is to say something to do with experience, that the experience is not repeatable, that you can't go again and look at that map and feel again that experience of learning a new thing or experiencing a thing as if for the first time. So the map's gone, it has to be imagined now. That experience can only be imagined and cannot be renewed by revisiting the classroom. Maybe something like that as well as the possibility that, yes, okay, next time you try to draw that map, try it, go to a blackboard and try and see if it works. It might not. Africa might be too distended, or Europe might be too fat or something, so you might not quite get it right. But it's a thought that maps in particular are prone, until that is they get down to doing it scientifically, that maps are prone to variety in a sense, to an emphasis which alters their shape or the there's a map in the gallery, which is a map of, it's a very good map actually. I mean, in the sense of its likeness to modern, accurate maps, because very often medieval maps are imaginary in this important sense that they bulge in the wrong places or contain information about certain places, which means inevitably they are distorted because that part of the world is known, the other parts of the world are not. So many maps of the medieval period show China as just a tiny little space up there, as it were, a line or two up there, whereas they would show India, say, as huge, the size of a continent, because they know about them, but they don't know about that. So in that respect, maps are distorting because they reflect what's known, or they reflect, a certain, like I said earlier, Jerusalem, the center of the world, so that if you look at those medieval Christian maps, the Holy Land looks huge compared, say, even to Egypt or sort of surrounding areas, because so that way of thinking of it would mean that when you do it again, you would have to be kind of like conscious, or at least skeptical, or at least aware of where this map's coming from, and not as a true likeness. But I think I prefer the other one of saying that it's to do with experience, and that you can't, especially when experience is like that, as he's describing it, like it's an experience which has an impact, that this is unrepeatable. In fact, I think he uses the word unrepeatable, that you cannot go and visit this again as if it hasn't happened.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, thank you all for coming, for being part of our seminar today, and please join me in thanking Abdulrazak Gurnah and Claire Chambers. Thank you.
Thank you.